Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to talk about how to dress vintage on a budget. This is a question I have gotten several times and I don't actually spend a lot of money on clothing myself. So I feel like I do have some good tips that you can use if you want to dress more vintage or vintage style, but you don't have a lot of money to spend on clothing. So the first tip I have is probably the biggest and most important, and the thing that I actually started with on my kind of more vintage clothing journey, and that is to take a good look at your wardrobe, your current wardrobe, what you already own, and see if there are any items in your wardrobe that could work as a vintage looking piece as well. A lot of the items that we consider classics nowadays first came into existence in previous decades, like the 40s, 50s, 60s. So there's a good chance you already have stuff in your wardrobe that could pass as vintage looking if you combine it in a little bit of a different way. Things such as t-shirt, anything with a boat neck, skirts, obviously, any skirts that are longer for a more 40s, 50s look, shorter skirts for 60s, 70s. White blouses work for pretty much any decade. And while you're doing this, try and pay attention to silhouette. So what silhouette do things have? And is there any way you could change the silhouette of existing pieces to look more vintage? So very often I feel like you can make a piece look completely different by simply adding a belt or something like a sweater on top or a cardigan. A vest is a great item to make things look more vintage in my opinion. But so is just combining things with skirts. I feel like things like that can already make a huge difference. So definitely start by assessing what you already have in your wardrobe. The second tip I have is to talk to your older family members and see if they have anything in their wardrobes that they no longer wear and will be willing to part with. For me personally, 80s and even 70s clothing is pretty accessible just through older family members' closets, but you might be able to go back even further. And that is obviously a super easy, super accessible and free way of acquiring some extra vintage pieces. You'd be surprised how big of a portion of my closet actually comes out of my grandmother's closets. Secondhand stores. So vintage, actual like dedicated vintage stores can be quite expensive. I know I definitely am often startled and taken back by the prices there, but normal secondhand stores can often harbor secret, hidden, very vintage or vintage looking reproduction pieces. Especially if the collections aren't very curated, you might find loads of items that are or look vintage, again depending on what era you're going for, but that is a very easy and inexpensive way to come across vintage clothing. So I already talked briefly about altering silhouettes to make things more vintage. Often what is most characteristic about clothing from a certain decade is the silhouette of the clothing. So if you have a certain decade in mind that you would like to emulate the fashion of, then altering silhouettes of existing clothing that doesn't have that exact silhouette is a great option to get there. So you might do that to items that you already have in your closet. You could do that to hand-me-downs or secondhand items that you buy from the thrift store. Sometimes there's just a little adjustment that needs to be made to make something look more vintage. For example, you might take in the waist of a skirt to make it high-waisted. You can make some wider or kind of straight leg pants into cigarette pants by rolling up the cuff and making them a bit more slim towards the bottom. You could add a belt or accessories to an outfit. And there are lots of little ways that you can tweak existing pieces to make them look more vintage. Speaking of accessories, doing your hair and makeup in a way that really screams whatever decade you're going for is a great way to make your whole outfit automatically look more vintage. I feel like hair and makeup does so much to transform an outfit and really kind of translate what you are trying to accomplish with an outfit. Simply curling your hair and putting on the red lipstick is a great way to make anything you're wearing look more vintage. I have a bunch of tutorials on how you can get that beautiful fluffy brush out look, so I will link that in the info card up here. You can go check that out. That is a great way to very easily and pretty much for free change your outfit into a more vintage looking one. Another relatively inexpensive way to come by vintage looking clothing is to make it yourself. There are loads and loads and loads of vintage sewing patterns out there that you can often get for pretty inexpensive. Not everybody realizes their value, and sometimes they are in estate sales or you can find them online on kind of like secondhand reselling stores. And if you follow a vintage pattern, you will end up with an actually authentic vintage piece, or at least that's how I view it, especially if you use a fabric that is very similar to the fabrics that would have been used in that year that the pattern is from. If you are able to find fabric that is relatively inexpensive, then sewing yourself can definitely be a cheaper option, especially knowing that you will get exactly what you are looking for, that it fits perfectly, it has the right shape and size and everything. A good way to find inexpensive fabrics are thrift stores, secondhand stores again. You can often find textiles there, both like actual just meters of fabric, but also curtains, tablecloths, things like that, bed sheets. Or you could look for sales at fabric stores. That is what I do. I like to go to the Albert Kuip market here in Amsterdam, and there are always some fabrics on sale. And I just look through, see if there's anything I like there. And that is how I like to buy my fabrics more inexpensively. Plus vintage patterns, especially if you have made them and you have an example of the finished products, can be resold again. So the last two options, I guess, I have left for last because I feel like this is an option that shouldn't be encouraged too much. I feel like we should try and move away from this as much as possible. But you can buy lots of vintage reproduction or vintage style retro in high street stores and web shops that sell fast fashion. There are web shops that sell specifically kind of retro pin-up style clothing for pretty inexpensive prices. They are usually made of polyester and other kind of synthetic fabrics and not the best craftsmanship, but they are available if you have a low budget and, you know, don't have access to any of the other options that I named here. But also just your normal kind of clothing stores, typical clothing stores, tend to sometimes carry clothing that looks vintage style, and a lot of my wardrobe actually is that from the earlier days of building my wardrobe before I started to make a lot myself and do more thrifting. I would just shop in the stores that I always used to shop in, but just try and find more vintage looking pieces. Those are definitely options if those are, you know, the most accessible to you. Those are my tips on how you can dress more vintage, come buy more vintage clothing on a budget. So I really hope you found this helpful, guys, and you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for loads more beauty and lifestyle content. If you would like to support me through Patreon or my merch store, there'll be links in the description box below. Thank you so much for your support. There is another video here that I think you might also enjoy. You can go watch next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon in my next video. Bye!